Julian arrives uninvited to birthday party. John's words left guests speechless. John Lennon was celebrating his 35th birthday at the Dakota Building in New York City when someone knocked on the door that nobody expected. The person standing there would force John to face the one truth he'd been running from for years. And what happened next changed everything. It was October 9th, 1975. The Dakota Building on West 72nd Street was alive with music, laughter, and the kind of energy that only a Lennon party could generate. Inside apartment 72, about 40 guests were celebrating John's 35th birthday. Elton John was at the piano. David Bowie was telling stories in the corner. Yoko was orchestrating everything with her usual precision. But missing from this celebration was someone who should have been there. Someone whose absence haunted every birthday candle John blew out. Someone whose face looked so much like John's that it was impossible to forget. Julian Lennon, John's 12-year-old son from his first marriage. The boy he'd left behind in England when he chose a new life in America with Yoko. The party was in full swing. The champagne was flowing. The cocaine was being passed around discreetly. This was 1975 New York, after all. The city that never sleeps was John's playground now, and he was playing hard. "Make a wish, John," Yoko said, lighting the candles on an elaborate cake that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. John closed his eyes, and in that moment, despite the noise and the people and the excess, he thought about Julian. He always thought about Julian on his birthday, because Julian's birthday was the same day, October 9th. Father and son, born on the same day, 12 years apart. Living on different continents, barely speaking. John blew out the candles. Everyone cheered. And that's when the knocking started. 3 firm knocks on the apartment door. Not the doorbell, knocking. Insistent, deliberate. The music didn't stop, but a few people near the entrance noticed. One of John's assistants went to answer it, expecting maybe a late guest or a delivery. What he found instead was a 12-year-old boy standing in the Dakota hallway, shaking slightly, wearing a jacket that was too thin for October in New York. Holding a small wrapped present. "I'm here to see my dad," Julian Lennon said, his British accent sharp and clear in the American building. "It's his birthday. It's my birthday too." The assistant stood frozen in the doorway, looking at this kid who had John Lennon's eyes, John Lennon's jawline, John Lennon's presence. There was no mistaking who this child was. "Wait here," the assistant said, panic in his voice. He closed the door and rushed through the party crowd to find John. Johnny was in the middle of a conversation with Mick Jagger about the state of rock and roll when his assistant pulled him aside and whispered something in his ear that made John's face go completely white. "What did you say?" John asked, his voice suddenly cold and sober, despite the champagne he'd been drinking. "Your son is here, Julian. He's at the door." The music kept playing, the guests kept laughing, but for John Lennon, time stopped completely. How did Julian get here? How did he even know where John lived? The Dakota was supposed to be secure, private, protected. And more importantly, why was he here? Why now? John's mind raced through possibilities. Cynthia, his ex-wife, must have sent him. This was some kind of setup, some kind of statement. Or maybe Julian had run away. Maybe he'd flown to New York alone, somehow. That didn't make sense. But nothing about this moment made sense. "John?" Yoko appeared at his side, reading his face immediately. "What's wrong?" "Julian's here," John said quietly, "at the door." Yoko's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. She and Julian had a complicated relationship, or rather, they had no relationship at all. Yoko was the woman who in Julian's young mind had stolen his father away. "What are you going to do?" Yoko asked. It was the question that would define everything that followed. What was John going to do? Turn his own son away on their shared birthday? Pretend he wasn't home? Or face the boy he'd been avoiding for years? Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. The party noise felt impossibly loud now. Elton John was still playing piano, oblivious to the drama unfolding near the entrance. Guests were dancing, drinking, celebrating. They had no idea that just beyond that door stood the ghost of John Lennon's past. John walked slowly toward the entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand on the knob, and took a deep breath. Then he opened it. Julian stood there, small for 12, thin, with shaggy hair that hadn't been cut in a while, and eyes that held a mixture of hope, fear, and defiance. He was clutching that small wrapped present so tightly his knuckles were white. Father and son stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. "Happy birthday, Dad," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly. "Happy birthday to us." John didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at this boy who was becoming a young man, this son who carried his DNA and his musical talent and his trauma. "How did you get here?" John finally asked. Not hello, not happy birthday, just the practical question that avoided the emotional one. "I flew," Julian said simply. "Mom doesn't know. I used the money Aunt Mimi sent me for my birthday. I took a taxi from the airport. I remembered the address from the letters you used to send. The letters John used to send, past tense, because John had stopped writing consistently about a year ago. The guilt of that reality hit John like a physical blow. "You flew alone? From Liverpool?" "I'm 12, Julian said, lifting his chin with a pride that was pure Lennon stubbornness. "I'm not a baby." Behind John, some of the party guests had started to notice what was happening. The music had lowered slightly. People were whispering. This wasn't just a late guest. This was drama, and everyone could sense it. "Can I come in?" Julian asked. "It's cold out here, and it's my birthday too. I thought maybe we could celebrate together, like we used to." Like we used to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with memory and accusation. John stood in that doorway, facing a choice that had been coming for years. And everyone in that apartment was watching now, waiting to see what kind of man John Lennon really was. The rebel who sang about peace and love, the activist who preached compassion, the father who had abandoned his first son for a new life. "Come in," John said finally, stepping aside. Julian walked into the Dakota apartment, his eyes going wide as he took in the scene. The expensive furniture, the famous faces, the wealth on display everywhere. This was a different world from the modest life he lived with his mother in England. The party had gone almost completely silent now. Elton John had stopped playing. David Bowie was staring. Yoko was standing in the center of the room, her expression unreadable. "Everyone," John said, his voice carrying across the room. "This is Julian, my son. It's his birthday too." The silence was deafening. Some people smiled awkwardly, others looked away. Everyone knew the story. John had left his first family for Yoko. He'd written songs about it. Imagine no possessions while living in one of New York's most exclusive buildings. All you need is love while rarely seeing his firstborn child. Julian stood there holding his present, suddenly very aware that he didn't belong in this room. These people with their designer clothes and their drugs and their casual intimacy with his father. He was an outsider in his own father's life. "Why don't you put your coat down?" John said, gesturing vaguely. "Are you hungry? Have you eaten?" "I'm fine," Julian said quietly. "I brought you something for your birthday, our birthday." He held out the present. It was wrapped in newspaper, not proper wrapping paper. The tape was crooked. It was clearly wrapped by a 12-year-old boy with limited resources. John took it, and for a moment, something crossed his face. Shame, maybe, or regret, or just the weight of everything he'd chosen not to deal with. "Should I open it now?" John asked. "If you want," Julian said. "It's not much, but I made it myself." John carefully unwrapped the newspaper. Inside was a framed drawing. It showed two people, clearly a father and son, playing guitars together. The drawing was simple but skillful. You could see real talent in the lines, in the way Julian had captured movement and emotion. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, it read, "Happy birthday, Dad. Love, Jules. October 9th, 1975. John stared at that drawing for a long time. Too long. The silence in the room became uncomfortable. "It's beautiful," John finally said, his voice thick. "Really beautiful, Jules." "Do you still play guitar?" Julian asked suddenly. "You used to teach me chords. Do you remember? When I was little, you'd let me sit on your lap, and you'd put my fingers on the strings." The question hit John like an accusation, because yes, he remembered. He remembered everything he'd left behind. Every lesson he never finished. Every promise he never kept. Every birthday he missed after he moved to New York with Yoko and built this new life. "I remember," John said quietly. "I practice every day," Julian continued, his voice getting stronger. "I'm getting really good. Mom says I have your talent. I write songs too. I thought maybe you could listen to them sometime. Maybe we could write something together." Everyone in that room could feel the desperation in Julian's voice. This wasn't just about a birthday visit. This was about a son trying to connect with a father who had chosen to disconnect. "That sounds great, Jules," John said. But there was something hollow in his voice. Something that said he was saying what he should say, not what he meant. Julian heard it too. Kids always do. "You don't mean that," Julian said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You're just saying it because everyone's watching." The room went completely silent. Even the sounds from outside seemed to fade away. "Jules, that's not—" "Yes, it is." Julian's voice cracked, tears starting to form in his eyes. "You don't want me here. You haven't wanted me since you left. You stopped writing. You stopped calling. It's like I don't exist anymore. Like you got a new life, and I'm just something from before that you'd rather forget." John looked around the room at all these people watching. At Yoko, at his friends, at the life he'd built, and then back at this 12-year-old boy who was calling him out in front of everyone. What John Lennon said next would become legendary. Not because it was kind or wise or compassionate, but because it was brutally, devastatingly honest. And everyone in that room would remember it for the rest of their lives. "You're right," John said, his voice quiet but clear. "You're absolutely right, Jules." The admission shocked everyone. People expected John to deflect, to make excuses, to smooth things over. But John Lennon, for all his flaws, had never been good at lying. "I haven't been a good father to you," John continued, setting down the drawing carefully. "I left. I chose this life over being in your life, and I can give you 100 reasons why. But none of them would change the fact that you've spent years wondering why your dad didn't love you enough to stay." Tears were streaming down Julian's face now, but he stood his ground, staring at his father. "But here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud," John said, and his voice was getting stronger now, more defiant. "Sometimes being a parent means admitting that you're not good at it. Sometimes it means accepting that the best thing you can do for your kid is not pretend to be something you're not." "John," Yoko said quietly, a warning in her voice. But John wasn't done. Years of guilt and resentment and self-loathing were pouring out now, in front of everyone. "You think I'm a hero because I wrote Imagine?" John said, addressing not just Julian, but the whole room now. "You think I'm enlightened because I talk about peace? But I'm a mess," Jules. I'm an angry, selfish, screwed-up mess who barely knows how to take care of himself, let alone a kid. That's not true, Julian said through his tears. You were good with me when I was little. I remember. You used to make me laugh. You used to take me to the park. I was playing at being a father, John said harshly, like I was trying on a costume. And when it got hard, when it got real, I bailed. That's what I do, Jules. I bail. Ask anyone in this room. Ask my bandmates. Ask my first wife. Hell, ask Yoko. I'm great at the beginning of things and terrible at the follow-through. The guests were frozen. This was car crash television before reality TV existed. This was raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth. But you're my dad, Julian said, his voice small and broken. You're supposed to try. Even if you're bad at it. Even if you fail, you're supposed to try. And that's when John Lennon did something that nobody expected. He sat down right there on the floor of his expensive Dakota apartment, in front of all his famous friends, and he started to cry. Not quiet tears, sobbing. The kind of crying that comes from years of suppressed guilt and shame and self-hatred. You're right, John said through his tears. You're absolutely right. I should have tried harder. I should have been there. I should have been the dad you deserved, instead of the dad I was. Julian stood there, 12 years old, watching his father fall apart. Part of him wanted to comfort John. Part of him wanted to hurt him more. Part of him just wanted to run back to the airport and fly home and forget he ever came. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he walked over and sat down on the floor next to his father, and he just sat there, present, silent, together. The two of them sat there for several minutes, father and son, both born on October 9th, both carrying the Lennon name, both damaged by the choices John had made. Finally, John wiped his eyes and looked at Julian. I can't promise I'll be a good dad, Jules. I can't promise I'll suddenly become the father you want, but I can promise to stop pretending, to stop avoiding you, to stop acting like you're not part of my life. What does that mean? Julian asked. It means you can call me whenever you want, John said. It means I'll answer. It means if you want to come visit, you can. It means I'll stop hiding from you, because hiding from you means hiding from my own failures, and I'm tired of hiding. Julian nodded slowly. It wasn't everything he wanted. It wasn't the fantasy reunion he'd imagined on the plane from England. But it was something. It was honest. And at 12 years old, Julian was old enough to understand that sometimes honesty is more valuable than empty promises. What nobody in that room understood was that this moment was about more than just a father and son. This was about John Lennon confronting every demon he'd spent years running from. And those demons were darker than anyone knew. John stood up from the floor, helping Julian to his feet. The party guests were still frozen, unsure whether to clap or cry or pretend none of this had happened. You know what the worst part is? John said, and now he was talking to the room as much as to Julian. The worst part is that I write all these songs about love and peace and changing the world, and I can't even show up for my own kid. I preach about imagine no possessions while living in a building with a doorman. I talk about brotherhood while treating the people closest to me like disposable props in my story. John, stop, Yoko said more firmly now. You're drunk. You don't know what you're saying. I'm not drunk enough, John shot back. And I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that I'm a fraud, Yoko. We're all frauds. Every single one of us in this room who pretends to be better than we are. He turned back to Julian. You came here tonight thinking your dad was John Lennon the Beatle, John Lennon the peace activist, John Lennon the genius. But I'm not that guy, Jules. That guy's a marketing creation. The real John Lennon is standing in front of you right now. Flawed, selfish, scared. I know you're not perfect, Julian said quietly. I just wanted you to be my dad. Not a Beatle, not a celebrity, Just my dad." Those words hit John harder than anything else Julian could have said. Because they were simple, true, devastating. "I don't know if I can be that," John admitted. "I don't know if I know how anymore." "Then learn," Julian said, and suddenly this 12-year-old sounded much older than his years. "You learned how to write songs. You learned how to play guitar. You learned how to be famous. Learn how to be my father." The challenge hung in the air. Around them, people started quietly leaving. This had gone from an entertaining spectacle to something too intimate, too real. Elton John slipped out. David Bowie made his excuses. Within 15 minutes, the apartment had cleared out except for John, Yoko, Julian, and a couple of close assistants. Yoko walked over to John and Julian. For a moment, there was tension. Yoko and Julian had never had a relationship. Julian blamed her for breaking up his family. Yoko saw him as a complication from John's past. But what Yoko said next surprised everyone, including herself. "He's right, John," Yoko said simply. "Julian's right. You need to figure out how to be his father. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Now." John looked at his wife, genuinely shocked. Yoko had never pushed him toward Julian before. She'd always supported his distance, his new life, his forward focus. "I mean it," Yoko continued. "I watched my father disappear into his work when I was young. I know what it does to a child. Julian deserves better, and so do you." John stood there, caught between his past and his present, between the son he'd left and the wife he'd chosen. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices, not as guilt, but as responsibility. "Okay," John said finally, looking at Julian. "Okay, you're staying here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out a plan. But tonight, on our birthday, we're going to celebrate together, properly." Julian's face lit up with cautious hope. "Really?" "Really," John said. "And Jules, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the birthdays I missed. I'm sorry for not being there. I'm sorry for being too chicken shit to face you, because facing you meant facing how badly I'd failed." "You're here now," Julian said. "That's what matters." What happened over the next few hours would change both their lives. John Lennon, one of the most famous men in the world, spent his 35th birthday getting to know his 12-year-old son. Really know him. Not as an obligation or a source of guilt, but as a human being. They ordered pizza. Not expensive catered food, just regular New York pizza. They sat on the floor of John's music room, and Julian showed John the songs he'd been writing. John listened carefully, offering real feedback, real encouragement. And for the first time in years, John felt like he was doing something that mattered. "This one's really good, Jules," John said, listening to Julian sing a song he'd written about feeling invisible. "The chord progression is sophisticated. And the lyrics, they're honest. That's what matters in songwriting. Honesty." "You think so?" Julian asked, his face lighting up. "I know so," John said. "You've got real talent, and not just because you're my son. You've got something to say, and you know how to say it." They talked about music, about school, about Liverpool, about what it was like growing up as John Lennon's son, about the kids who wanted to be Julian's friend just because of his last name, about the pressure of living in the shadow of a legend. "It must be hard," John said, "carrying my name." "Sometimes," Julian admitted. "People expect me to be like you, and I am like you in some ways. But I'm also me, you know? I'm not just John Lennon's son. I'm Julian." "You're absolutely right," John said. "And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you were just an extension of me. You're your own person. Your own artist, your own man." As the night wore on, Yoko brought them tea and sat with them for a while. The conversation was awkward at first, but gradually something shifted. Julian saw that Yoko wasn't the villain he'd imagined. She was just another person trying to navigate a complicated situation. And Yoko saw that Julian wasn't a threat to her relationship with John. He was just a kid who wanted his father. Around 2 a.m., as Julian was falling asleep on John's couch, John sat there watching him. This boy who carried half his DNA. This son who had every right to hate him, but had flown across the ocean just to spend one birthday together. "I've been running from you," John whispered, knowing Julian was asleep and couldn't hear him. "Because you reminded me of every way I've failed, every choice I got wrong, every time I chose my career over being a father. But you're not my failure, Jules. You're my chance to do better." The next morning, John made a decision. He called Cynthia in England and told her that Julian had shown up, that he was safe, and that John wanted him to stay for a week. Cynthia was furious at first, angry that Julian had flown to New York alone. But she heard something in John's voice that she hadn't heard in years. Sincerity, commitment, change. "Take care of him, John," Cynthia said finally. "Please, just this once, take care of him." "I will," John promised. "I swear it." That week in October 1975 became legendary in Lennon family history. John took Julian all over New York City, not to famous restaurants or celebrity events, to record stores, to street musicians in Central Park, to small clubs where unknown artists were playing their hearts out. He showed Julian the raw, creative side of New York, the side that had nothing to do with fame or money, the side that was about art and passion and expression. They wrote a song together. It was never recorded professionally, never released, but they wrote it, the two of them, sitting at John's piano, combining their ideas and their voices. And for both of them, it was the most important song they'd ever work on. When it was time for Julian to fly back to England, John went with him to the airport. Not an assistant, not a driver. John himself, carrying Julian's bag, walking into the gate. "This isn't the end," John said, hugging his son. "This is the beginning. I'm going to do better, Jules. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I promise I'll try." "That's all I wanted," Julian said, "just for you to try." The story of Julian's uninvited appearance at John's birthday party became legendary. Not just among Lennon fans, but among anyone who understood the complexity of family, failure, and redemption. John did do better after that night. Not perfectly. He still missed calls sometimes. He still got caught up in his own world. But he tried. He made an effort. He showed up more than he had before. In the years that followed, John and Julian developed something real. Not the fantasy father-son relationship that Julian had dreamed of as a small child, but something honest, something imperfect but genuine. Julian would later say, "That night changed everything, not because my father suddenly became perfect, but because he stopped pretending. He stopped hiding behind fame and excuses. He became real with me, and that was all I ever wanted." The guests at that party never forgot what they witnessed. Many of them were parents themselves, and watching John Lennon, one of the most famous men in the world, break down in front of his son reminded them of their own failures, their own distances from their children, their own masks. Several of them reached out to their own estranged children after that night. Something about witnessing John's vulnerability gave them permission to be vulnerable too. The drawing Julian gave John that night, the one wrapped in newspaper showing a father and son playing guitars together, hung in John's music room for the rest of his life. After John's death in 1980, Julian asked for it back. It still hangs in his home today, a reminder of the night he forced his father to confront the truth. The story teaches us something profound about parenthood and pride, and the courage it takes to admit when we're failing. John Lennon could have turned Julian away that night. He could have made excuses. He could have protected his image and his party and his comfortable distance. Instead, he did the hardest thing any parent can do. He admitted he was wrong. He acknowledged his failures. He stopped hiding, and in doing so, he gave Julian something more valuable than any expensive gift or empty promise. He gave him honesty. He gave him presence. He gave him a father who was flawed but real. Today, when people talk about John Lennon's legacy, they talk about the music, the activism, the cultural impact. But those who were in that Dakota apartment on October 9th, 1975, will tell you that John's greatest moment wasn't on a stage or in a studio. It was on the floor of his living room, crying in front of his son, admitting his failures, and choosing to do better. Julian Lennon went on to become a successful musician in his own right. And in interviews, when people ask him about his relationship with his father, he's honest about the complexity, about the pain, about the distance. But he also talks about that birthday, the one they shared, the one where everything changed. "My father wasn't a saint," Julian has said. "He was a complicated, difficult, brilliant mess of a human being. But that night, for the first time in years, he was just my dad. Imperfect, present, real. And that was enough." The real lesson of that October night isn't about forgiveness or redemption or perfect endings. It's about the courage to be honest, to admit when we're failing, to stop hiding behind our personas and our excuses, and just be present with the people who need us most. John Lennon taught millions of people to imagine a better world. But the night Julian showed up uninvited to his birthday party, John learned something he'd forgotten: that changing the world starts with showing up for the people right in front of us, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If this story of unexpected honesty and painful truth moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of being real with the people we love. Have you ever had to confront someone you love about their absence? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the complex humanity behind music's greatest legends.